It started like something out of a dream. A luxury getaway in Zanzibar, a private villa, ocean views, and a couple who had just taken a major step in their relationship. But behind that picture-perfect setup, something felt off, almost immediately. The story of Ashley Janae and Joe McCann didn't unfold like a vacation. It unraveled like a mystery. Because within days, that same villa would become the center of a disturbing discovery. A young woman, found in a condition that raised more questions than answers. No clear explanation, no immediate clarity, just silence, confusion, and a timeline that didn't quite sit right with anyone who looked closely. And the more details that started coming out, the less this looked like a tragic accident, and more like something that had been building beneath the surface from the very beginning. From the moment they arrived, things weren't as smooth as they seemed. Ashley and Joe didn't settle into that peaceful vacation rhythm most couples expect. Instead, tension followed them into paradise. There were arguments, not just minor disagreements, but heated confrontations that caught the attention of people nearby. Locals and resort staff began noticing the pattern almost immediately. Something was clearly wrong between them, and whatever it wasn't being hidden very well. This wasn't a slow build of problems over time. It was instant friction, the kind that makes people uncomfortable to witness. And while most guests come to places like this to escape stress, it seemed like Ashley and Joe had brought theirs with them. But what no one realized at the time was just how quickly that tension would spiral into something far more serious. As more information surfaced, a completely different side of Joe began to emerge, one that didn't match the image of a tourist visiting for the first time. He wasn't new to Zanzibar. In fact, he knew the area well. He knew the people, the routines, the environment. And according to multiple accounts, he wasn't spending all his time with Ashley either. There were claims that he would leave her alone in the villa, disappearing for hours at a time. And where he was going became a major part of the story. Allegations started circulating that he was meeting local women, creating a secret life parallel to the one he had brought Ashley into. For her, this wasn't just betrayal. It became a source of constant conflict. And suddenly, the arguments that people witnessed started to make more sense. This wasn't just tension. It was a relationship under pressure from something much deeper. At some point, the situation escalated beyond what could be ignored. One of the arguments became so intense that it drew the attention of neighboring guests. Someone staying nearby reportedly alerted hotel staff, forcing them to step in. That alone says a lot about how serious things had become. The staff made a decision that would later raise even more questions. They separated Ashley and Joe into different villas. On the surface, it seemed like a reasonable attempt to calm things down. But the details of that decision didn't quite sit right. Joe was moved to a location that was several minutes away, creating physical distance between the two. And while that might sound like a solution, it also created something else entirely. A controlled setup. One that would later be used to shape the timeline of events in a very specific way. Then came the timeline, the part of the story that should have provided clarity, but instead created even more confusion. That evening, an attendant visited Ashley's villa during his routine rounds. She asked him for a phone charger, and he gave it to her. A simple interaction. But what happened next is where everything starts to feel strange. Ashley reportedly told him to come back in a few minutes so she could return it. When he came back, there was no response. The lights were off. Something felt wrong. Using an emergency key, he entered the room. And that's when he found her. Still alive, but in critical condition. He raised the alarm, and she was rushed to the hospital. But despite efforts to save her, she passed away the next day. The sequence sounds straightforward, until you start looking at the timing. Because somehow, everything happened in a way that conveniently placed Joe far away from the scene. And that's exactly what people began questioning. Locals who were familiar with the area started speaking up, and their perspective added a completely different layer to the story. They pointed out that Joe wasn't just familiar with Zanzibar, he understood how things worked behind the scenes. There were whispers about connections, about influence, about the possibility that certain situations could be handled quietly if someone knew the right people. Suddenly, the idea that he was placed in a villa far enough away to eliminate suspicion didn't feel random anymore. It felt calculated. Some even suggested that the timeline itself may have been structured in a way that protected him. And when those kinds of doubts start spreading, the entire narrative begins to shift from a tragic situation to something that might have been carefully managed. As investigators and online communities dug deeper, more details from Joe's past began to surface, and they didn't help his image. His previous marriage raised serious questions. Reports described tension, difficult decisions, and behavior that hinted at deeper issues. One detail stood out more than anything. His ex-wife reportedly walked down the aisle alone on their wedding day. A moment that's usually filled with support turned into something symbolic. And the story didn't end there. The marriage eventually fell apart, with claims of aggressive behavior and a sudden exit from the relationship while she was expecting their second child. These weren't just random details. They painted a pattern that made people reconsider everything happening in Zanzibar. Because if history leaves clues, then this wasn't an isolated situation. Then came the pieces of evidence that made the situation even harder to ignore. One of the most talked about details was Ashley's engagement ring, reportedly found in a rental car, not in her room. And what made it even more concerning were claims that it had visible stains that needed to be tested. At the same time, Ashley's family was still waiting for answers. The autopsy had been completed, but the results hadn't been released. Communication was limited. Information was delayed. And that silence created a growing sense of frustration and suspicion. Because when answers are withheld, people start asking bigger questions. What really happened in that villa? Why does the timeline feel so controlled? And is there something in that report that someone doesn't want the public to see? In the end, this case leaves more questions than conclusions. On the surface, it could be explained as a tragic and unfortunate event. But when you look closer at the arguments, the timeline, the background, and the missing information, it becomes much harder to accept a simple explanation. The possibility that there's more to the story continues to grow.